Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Cranbourne East Secondary Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for giving us a week's break last week as we tried to get everything back in place. So, once again, you have myself, Mr. L, and we also have as well at the bottom down there. Yep.
Oh wait, that's that. Am I on the bottom?
Yep.
Okay. My name's Medival. Hello.
And we also have a special guest today over here, which is
Mr. Coates.
Hey, thank you for jumping on, Mr. Coates.
No worries, my pleasure.
All right. So, usually when we have a new teacher on, the first thing we ask them is, Mr. Coates, if none of the listeners here have ever had you as a teacher before, what do you teach at our school? Like what year levels, what subjects?
Oh, well, I teach humanities. So I teach generally year 10 at the moment, and year 9 and year 8. So I've taught up humanities. I've taught 7 before as well in the past. And at my previous school, I've actually taught VCE at my previous school as well. So that was many moons ago. I think that was about, I was trying to calculate that the other week. I think that was about 10 years ago. I was teaching VCE, so yeah.
That always reminds me of that joke I always make about you, Mr. Coates, about how you're ancient and old. I'm sorry, but you brought it up. I just nearly had to go there, but I was like, you know what, Mr. L, I'm not being mean today.
Well, I mean, I haven't been teaching for that long. It's 14 years, I think.
14 years.
But I mean, and there's teachers out there who've been teaching for a lot longer and stuff like that. So I'm still new to the game, but yeah, when you think about how long it's been since I've taught VCE history, there's been a lot of changes, I think, over the years since I've taught that. So
yeah, so with the VC history subjects that you used to teach, was it like based on a specific time period, or was it more spread out? Because, like, for example, when I was in high school, I don't know about you, Mr. Young, and you might have had some friends that did VC history, but my school, it offered, I think it was Russian history in year 12 and then Chinese history in year 11 or something like that. How about you, Mr. Young? Do you remember what your school used to offer?
I don't know if my school actually offered history for VCE.
Wow, really? Like a big school like your one?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I don't remember it because I don't think a lot of people actually did it at my school in my year level. So that might have been a reason why it wasn't too memorable, like in terms of like us having VC history or not. But I remember having history in like before VC, so just like 7 to 10 VC history, and those were pretty fun classes. I have to admit, like kind of like go through them, and then you thought they were like just going to be okay. Now let's read this textbook page about this history, like this thing that happened now. But then like year 7 science, we mummified apples. Like,
but history at any age, year 7 to year 12 is fascinating, and it comes because once you start reading it, you read about the characters, you read about the profiles. Why did they do that? Why did they come to that? What decision? Why the hell did they make that decision? You know, it's fascinating in looking at that perspective, and you get that at any level. And I think at VCE you can go into more depth in that, but the point is you can still meet those characters at any level, and I think that's the important thing that can really grab students.
Yeah, definitely.
It's the personalities.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I know one of the more popular current movie trends and TV show trends that people are always talking about is, like, I know right now there's a TV show called What If that's on, like it's a Marvel property where if one little thing changed in this Marvel story, how the outcome would be completely different. And I just remember one of the things I love about history is when I watch like some videos on like watchmojo.com, it's like top 10 things that could have altered history. So for example, World War One, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, if that didn't happen, you know, then that wouldn't have led to World War One potentially, which then also potentially wouldn't have led to World War Two, and then all these things, right? And then I also learned that, for example, it was due to the Nazis who then actually had this program where they I think they colonized a certain area, and because of that, then one of the ABBA members was born, and then she wouldn't have been like ABBA wouldn't have been born if it wasn't for the Nazis, and all these crazy things of how things link. Yeah, but that's what I love about history. But Mr. Coates, like, do you want to give us a quick overview of what the history program is like at our junior school, at our school at the moment?
Well, I think the junior school, you've got the year sevens look at ancient history. So the sevens look at and they go right back to ancient Egypt and sort of, look at ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and that sort of area, but very much sort of focus on Egypt because there's just too much to look at, which I wish we had more time. But I know the sevens for a good couple of years have looked at ancient Egypt. Then you sort of get into year 8, you look at medieval Europe, and then you then look at medieval Europe, and you look at sort of the medieval Europe extending and the influences between medieval Europe and the Levant and sort of the Middle East and that connection things there and that sort of medieval history. So they get a good gamut of ancient history going into medieval history, which is fantastic for the junior years. And then year 9, they then get into more modern sort of areas. And we look at, I know in year 9, we've been looking at World War I, which a lot of kids find fascinating.
Yep.
And, again, you've got the characters, but then you've got the conditions, the human conditions that people have had to deal with. What they find it fascinating to know what soldiers had to face and why certain decisions were made and how they had to be so brave, how they had to sort of face those conditions and things like that. And, and the strain it put on them and all that stuff. And the fact that they were able to keep going, they find incredibly, amazing, which is, again, it's incredible history. And then we move on from World War I as a lead into year 10. They look at World War II, which, as you mentioned earlier, Tony, there's that connection between the two wars, and comes through Germany and things like that. So,
because of the treaty and how the Germans were treated. But I think for my high schooling, I'm talking about probably 15 years ago or so. Year 7 and year 8 were the same. Year 9, now I remember what it was. Actually, year 9 for us, we learned about Australian history. So we went in depth into Indigenous history and Australian history. Oh, I'm on the door. I won't edit this out. It's fine. But yeah, we looked at, for example, like Ned Kelly, of course, that's a big one. Then we looked at, of course, the First Fleet, which you do kind of touch on in primary school. Quite a lot of primary schools do, but we went into more detail about it. And then, like, even the White Australia policy, for example, eventually. And then year 10, I loved year 10 history, which was, we talked about Japanese history. And of course, I love Japanese culture. I can see Mr. smiling. Yep. So we went all the way back from feudal times and the Shogun times, because I loved playing those video games back then of like Dynasty Warriors and stuff. And we actually looked at the whole history, how it eventually led to their thinking, their perfectionism, and how it affected decisions to actually try to take on the rest of the Allies in World War II and Pearl Harbor. So that was year 10 for me. But yeah, do you remember your junior science years, Mr. Yule?
Junior science years, I definitely remember that we had studied about Ned Kelly and all. However, I think that was mainly in our English classes, not history for us. And so, like, we had some pretty interesting moments where we were able to go to the Melbourne jail. I'm not sure if Ned Kelly's suit of armor is still in the library, like the state library.
It was when I went there for excursion. Yep.
Yeah, so when I went there, I remember seeing that. But like the most distinct thing history for me was I would always doesn't matter who it is, like it always happens. So I'll read through something that someone's done, and then I'll always have this disconnect with that person where I'm like, why did you even do that? Like, that is the most stupidest reason you could do that. But then I'd actually have to step back and reflect that that is actually the norm at that time. So like, it's all has to do with like the factors or like different factors that are present within that little bubble of time. So yeah, that whole disconnect and then realization that well, this is how far I've come, and this is why I can see how where the disconnect is. And yeah, that was like always where I got interested.
Yeah, and that's an important point you raised there, Sam, is the fact that we have to get in our heads that different eras people thought differently. And when you're looking at history, you've got to sort of take yourself out of your own world and go, well, what were the people thinking about in the time? Why did they act like that? What were the reasons behind it? We can't sort of put ourselves in there and go, oh, they were very silly to do that. That they're making a total wrong decision, when we haven't looked at the factors behind why they've made it, if we're not looking or understanding at least their perspective and what they've been educated with, you know, and things like that. So that's quite important. So yeah, it's interesting when you come to that realization, you go, oh, that's, you know.
Sometimes the only reason we know it's a stupid decision is because they were the ones that tested it out for us.
Yes.
Exactly. So you never know. Like, you know, that's what they always say about the importance about learning about history, is so that you don't repeat the wrong stuff that happened in history. Definitely. So that's why. And we still do see history repeat itself sometimes in horrible ways sometimes, and sometimes pretty good ways as well. But yeah, that's definitely one thing I remember about history. But in my class, one thing I remember was, I think year 8, our history teacher got up on a chair. I don't know why she did this. She could have done this any other way, but she was trying to talk about how knights would used to ride on horses. We're like, okay, cool. And then so what she did was then she stood on top of a chair, right? Which OHS were not allowed today, right? She stood on top of a chair. It's like, oh yes, I would be like a knight looking over the fields and the plains, where it's like, really? Is this necessary? Like, we understand what it looks like for someone to be on a horse.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when they do tours, some of the tours they do of the American battlefields of the American Civil War is, for example, for I think one of the battlefields, it might be Gettysburg, is they have a horse tour where you can actually ride horses to get the view of what a general would see. And because a general's on a horse, they're commanding from a higher view. They've got to make decisions for like a regiment or a group of soldiers or a gun battery, like a cannon battery that might be, you know, a mile away. They've got to be able to see a higher level compared to the infantry who are on the ground. So they do the horse tours, so you can actually see and learn the difference of just even that perspective is a great distance that you might be able to see over a slight rise that people on the ground couldn't. So I think that's a great idea that your teachers doing. I reckon that's great. You know, that's fantastic. Getting it, and again, you remember it because you've engaged with it, because she's harnessed it and gone, well, let's show you history. Let's just not talk about it. Let's show it. And that's a big thing. You've got to engage kids, and we've got to, you know, always not lose that. And, you know, in science, in history, whatever subject, we've got to grab it and harness it, because that's how kids remember it. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, if somebody said to me, why did I get into history? When I was a little boy, I remember I was about 6. I was lucky enough to go to the UK, and my parents took me on the Victory. Now, the Victory was Admiral Nelson's flagship. Now, that was his big man-o'-war ship that was built around the 1700s that was used to fight against Napoleon. So it's part of the British Navy, and you could go on it. You could go on the replica, and they've made it to scale, and you could actually walk on the ship and see all the equipment and stuff. And you were taught about the cannons and where the guys had to stand, what they had to look out for. And you're like, this is amazing. I mean, in a classroom, you could read about that, or somebody could show you an image of it, but to feel it, to touch it, to see it, to be there is, you know, and if you can bring that into a classroom with a bit of that engagement by doing a bit of an acting or pretending, that's something you can really sort of grab kids with.
Definitely, yeah.
I kind of remember, I think one of the most memorable experiences I had as well was we had an excursion, I think in year 8, where we went and we had to dress up as people in the medieval. But the thing is, they didn't give you costumes. You had to make it yourself.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so like everyone had to dress up. People dressed up pretty well. I remember being in my family, I got like a white t-shirt and kind of cut up a gray t-shirt to make it fit, but then like I remember getting yelled at for cutting up a perfectly good t-shirt, but I digress. It was one of those experiences where like we could actually go in and then they'd teach us what folk dancing was like back then, and then like what different rooms of a castle would be like. And so yeah, I completely understand what you mean by the best experiences are the ones that are harnessed or like actually lived in, where you can actually go and kind of experience it for yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, and bringing them into the classroom, like you said, Tony, with that experience with the teacher, is, I mean, yes, we've got to be careful the way we bring it in, but as long as we don't lose that thinking of going, well, we can still bring it in somehow, and even if it's just a little game or you know, things like that, it's always good to just grab the kids. I mean, one little thing I do with my kids in classes when I'm talking about medieval history is I'll get them to stand up and put their arm out straight, right in front of them, and I get their pencil case and I put their pencil case on their hand, and I say, you've got to stand there and hold it, and then they've got to stand there and hold it, and after a little bit of time they go, it's getting a bit you know, it's starting to weigh a bit. And I go, exactly. And I said, that's what medieval archers used to do. That's what boys in England at the ages of 13 used to do, is hold a rock for as long as their parents said they've got to hold it for, with their arm out straight, so they could actually build the muscles in their forearm to be able to then hold the massive longbows that they had to hold. So it's little things like that you can do that get a kid to go, and then when they have to write about it, they can go, they can put it in an answer because they remember it.
Yeah, definitely. I remember one of the schools that I did my placements at, student teaching. They actually had a medieval day. They actually had people, I don't know where you get these people from, where you source them from, but there's companies where they come over to schools and they bring a horse, they bring armor, and they bring weapons. Like, they show you cases of different types of weapons. And I remember just doing my placements. I'm just sitting in the office and looking out the window of the oval, and there's just this guy swinging this morning star around. I'm just like, something that a rich private school would have that I've never seen before in my government school back in my day. But yeah, definitely, it's very immersive. That's the way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
I think the school did do something like that a few years ago. Where they had a medieval day, and I think even the kids tried medieval food or something like that. But they had people come in and show them the year 8s, I think, which was a good idea too. But you can definitely bring it in, like you said. It's great to hear stories of teachers bringing it in little ways, which is fantastic too. Those little ways, which is good.
I remember on my drive up to Bright for my road trip with some friends, there's a castle. It's of course not like, it wasn't an actual ancient castle. It was man built many years later. But that, I forgot the name of the castle, but it's on the way up to Bright, up in the north. And that castle, you literally go in and you can have like birthday parties there. They have medieval food. They have jousting. You get to joust for real, you know, like, of course not with swords, but you know, you still get to jump on things and you like joust each other with it. So it's very immersive. I'm like, oh wow, this place is like full on. They're really committed to that. Yeah.
I think it's actually, is it Cryal Castle? I think.
Yes, that's the name. That's the name.
Yep.
Yes. Now I remember.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I think for me, the most, because in terms of excursions at my school, I don't know about yours, Mr. Young, and your excursion, but the only real history-like excursion that I had that I remembered that really had an impact on me was, luckily in year, I think it was actually not even year, it was like grade 3 or grade 4. Our primary school took us to the ACT. We went to Canberra. And yeah,
wow.
So we went to Canberra, and so we were able to check out their Shrine of Remembrance, their war memorial. It's so much more detailed. They have all these things there, and I just remember looking at all the different Australian history, looking at like this Ned Kelly film as well. And yeah, that was one of the things that I remember very vividly. But did you have any history excursions that either of you, Mr. Coates, Mr. Young?
Do you want me to go first?
You go first while I have a think. I've got to have a think.
Sure.
So this actually ended up being a camp, and it's kind of like a private school flex. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Um, so year 9, at my private school sends us on a camp to China for 5 weeks.
Yep.
Yeah. So the history, like basically for the most of that camp duration, we learned about the history of Nanjing, which used to be called Nanking, and what had happened when the Japanese forces took over. So there's a like name for the whole event, which is kind of unfortunate, but basically they called it the Rape of Nanking because of how it was taken and all what was done. But basically, that was one of the most influential excursions that I went through because we went through learning everything about it. And then at the end of it, we went to the memorial for it. So that was to kind of recognize what had happened. And that was one of the, I think, more impactful excursions I've ever been on.
Yeah. It's like almost when I hear about our kids talk about the Holocaust Museum when they go visit it. Like I've never had a chance yet, but every student I've talked to, every teacher I've talked to that come back from the Holocaust Museum, they just talk about how impactful it is on them as well. Yeah.
Mm.
Mr. Coates, did you have any key memories of any excursions that either you ran or that you went to yourself as a student back then?
As a student, I just was thinking about this is as a student. This is grade 4, I think it is. This is grade 4. I can still remember washing the dishes. It was a camp, and we were staying at Sovereign Hill, and I remember sitting. One of the things is you go to the classroom, and the kids think today that they come in and they go, oh, all this stuff, and then you learn how different it was in the 1850s and 1860s with the slate boards and the chalk and having to write with your right hand. So if you're a lefty, like myself, I'm left-handed, I wasn't allowed to write with my left hand. And I remember the teacher walking around who was pretending to be somebody from the 1850s coming along and tapping my table. And she said quietly, do you know in the 1850s, you would have been hit on the hand for writing with your left hand? And I was like, would I? And she goes, yeah, because everybody was expected to write with their right hand and not their left. So that I remember that. That's quite amazing. That was a learning experience that stayed with me. But I also remember walking into the mines, and they were talking about in the 1850s too. They used to have the canaries in the cages to tell if there was enough air in the mine for people to breathe, and how they could judge how far down the mine they could go and stuff like that. So yeah, that was an excursion I can remember, which was it was a good experience.
Yeah, and I guess these days a lot of our kids can't even imagine a world without internet and smartphones, let alone thinking back then of like about pen and paper and all that stuff. I remember as well, like one key thing that interests me about history as well is different countries around the world have different emphasis on history and different parts. So for example, when you go talk to a teacher from America, for example, they would know a lot about the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the history that's happened there. So that's why I like watching YouTube channel called Oversimplified or Overly Simplified. They do cartoon versions of history and they make it very short, succinct, and very funny as well. But I remember also talking with my wife, who she actually did her high schooling in Singapore. And the thing is, for her, history, literally from primary school to high school, she can name you every single Chinese dynasty, who the emperor was, what was the key inventions of the time. And for me, I'm just like, yes, in China, there was dynasties and there were emperors. And exactly. And eventually it became modernized after, the Chinese Revolution. But, she would know all that stuff. But then their schools had absolutely no emphasis on any history on any other part of the world at all whatsoever. When we talk about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and Rome, all that stuff, she would have had no idea, So that's why we always have great conversations with each other about that as well. Yeah.
And I think that's amazing thing too, in the fact that it's really good seeing the knowledge that comes from our kids at the school. There's some great knowledge that they bring into the classes, which is fantastic. And you have those little conversations with them. And I think they've got to remember that, you know, they've got to have that confidence to tell us that stuff because they know more than what they say. And I think we've got to give them, you know, the credit where credit's due. You know, they do have, some of them do bring in this extra knowledge. We're like, wow, I didn't know that. And they like to test you. And you go, and you honestly go, I didn't know, you know, which is fantastic, which is good to see. So that's fantastic when they bring that in as well.
I remember like one sentence my teacher told me in, I think it was either year 7 or year 9, and it actually kind of struck, like, it made so much sense after I heard it. I think it was along the lines of history is written, or the history we know is written by the winners or the victors. And I was like, you know what? That is completely true. And the way we kind of like look at history can kind of be political in some way as well. So that like always kind of surprised me, because back then my whole idea of history was like, what is there is what happened, and that's it. Not, well, this is how people saw it.
Yeah, well, on that note, that brings us to our time in the show where we recommend different TV shows or movies that we've recently seen that we want to share with other people. So maybe I'll go first, because mine goes along the lines of something as well that's similar, where if this didn't happen, then what would happen? So I think it just got taken off Netflix at the start of this week, unfortunately. But I've been meaning to watch it for a long time, and I tried to get Mr. Weeks to watch it, but I watched a movie called Yesterday. So if you still have a chance to watch it from wherever it is, give it a shot. The basic premise of the movie is there's this struggling musician who he used to be a high school teacher, then he decided to become a musician. He wants to follow his dream. What happened was one day randomly, the whole world had this giant blackout. And then when the electricity came back on, some parts of history were completely gone forever. Like they're just like, almost as if they were snapped out of existence. And one of the key parts of history that was snapped out of existence was the Beatles. So this guy being a musician, he still could remember most of the chords, most of the lyrics of all the Beatles songs. And then so he starts gaining, gaining fame by playing Beatles songs and passing them off as his own. And the funny thing is, that wasn't the only thing that was like snapped out of existence. And so he slowly goes through the days finding out what other things disappeared. So like at the very end of this movie, one of the funny things he said was like, oh man, I feel like Harry Potter and I've just defeated Voldemort. That's how great I feel right now. And his partner asked him, like, who's Harry Potter? And then you can see that he quickly does a Google search, and when he types in Harry Potter, it comes up as Harold Potter, this army commander. And there's like no existence of Harry Potter the books. There's no Coca-Cola. There's only Pepsi. So when he asked the air stewardess, "Can I please have a Coke? Can I please have some Coke?" She just says it like, "What?" It's like, "Oh no, I mean a Pepsi. Can I have a Pepsi, please?" So yeah, it's a interesting take on what happened if some part of history didn't happen. Yeah, so that's my movie recommendation.
Yeah, so that's a good one.
Yeah, do you want to share your one?
Yeah, look, I think, and it's the one we were talking about earlier, I think, and I was sort of thinking about it because when you sort of said what's a movie and to recommend, and I know there's a lot of students that have been interested in anime, so it got me thinking. And so as we discussed, I was sort of thinking Valley of the Wind is quite an interesting film, and you know, it's got that as we were talking about the girl who's trying to, you know, sort of solve this big environmental issue between different groups, and as we were talking about, she's got the animal on the shoulder, and she's got to fight the big fire demon and defeat that, and sort of getting these groups to sort of come together to sort of, you know, help solve this problem. Yeah, it's quite a interesting film, and again, I haven't seen it in years, but yeah, it's worth a watch, I reckon. So I reckon the anime viewers at the school should give it a go and see what they think.
Yeah, it's out on Netflix at the moment anyway, so feel free to look at it there. It's from the same creator as Spirited Away, which you may have studied in year 7. or this year, the students who are studying Porco Rosso, yeah, it's from the same director. It was his very, very first movie. So it's called Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind. All right, over to you, Mr. Young, to wrap it up for us. What's yours?
Okay. Mine is a pretty known movie. It is kind of like a halfway between Mr. Leung and Mr. Coates' recommendations, where it is kind of it's on Netflix, and it is Harry Potter. So actually, I started watching Harry Potter nightly during remote. It's part of one of the biggest parts of my childhood. I don't know if you know this, Mr. Leung, but when I was actually a student teacher, I had basically a theme party, and the theme was 80s, but I decided to dress as Harry Potter because it was set I think it was written in the 80s,
Yeah.
or set in the 80s, so that's why I dressed up. I like Harry Potter so much, I made a wand out of my chopstick. So, yeah, sorry, Mum. Chopsticks is gone because of me. But basically, I've been watching Harry Potter to relive my childhood, and yeah, it's an amazing watch. If you haven't watched the movies at all, I would highly recommend watching it. I would recommend even more reading the books. The books are way better than what the movies have come out to be. And so, yeah, it's a good watch and good read.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode today. I just want to say a big thank you to Mr. Coates. Thank you for taking the time out of your week to spend with us to have a chat. Yep.
My pleasure.
Definitely. And listeners, definitely we'll hope to see you in the coming weeks again. If you've got any suggestions, feel free to, of course, contact myself or Mr. Young. And we just also want to say a big thank you to all you listeners, because we just hit 200 subscribers as well for this podcast. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope that during this time of lockdown, you keep looking after yourselves and that you can use us as a way to relax, hear about our day, hear about what we do at school as well. And yeah, we'll see you in the coming weeks. Until then, we'll see you. All right. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.